Gonna read another yarn, Barry Crump, 40 yarns on a song. Garth. I've seen and heard of some unusual pets in my time, but by far the most unusual one I ever ran into was Garth. It happened in the 60s. My wife and I were tin scratching at Mount Poverty in Helenvale, North Queensland, and it was there that we inherited Garth. We moved into a corrugated iron hut among trees on the bank of the Endeavour River and worked from there, diverting water and running the tin-bearing material over rifles and collecting the black grains of tin. 30 quid a bagful. You could make a living if you worked hard, and the profit if you were lucky as well. The previous occupant of the hut was a bloke called the Arab. He'd taken his entire menagerie with him when he left, but after 2 weeks he came back with Garth in a zipped-up bag. Garth wouldn't settle in the Arab's new camp out on the saltbush plain. He'd become listless and sulky, not eating, staying home curled up on his bunk all night, and generally making it plain that he was fretting for the cool water, rocks, and bush of Mount Poverty. Garth was 10, the Arab told us, and he'd had him since he was 7. We thought he was talking about Garth's age, but he meant his length and feet. You see, the Arab was a snake lover, and Garth was a 10-foot diamond-backed rock python. He liked people, the Arab assured us, and was completely harmless. He ate mice and rats and frogs and scraps and any kind of bird or egg. He liked the feet of fish or mince or wallaby leg whenever he could get it. He preferred to eat in the mornings and then curl up on his sacking bunk in the shade of the hut porch all day. At night, he usually went off hunting and came into the hut for any scraps at breakfast time. He loved coming for a swim with you in the river and having his neck stroked behind his head. Unlike the Arab, my wife and I weren't all that keen on snakes. We'd always given them a wide berth. The idea of having one hanging around the camp like a pet didn't appeal to us. Why don't you just take it somewhere and let it go, we wanted to know. Wouldn't be any use, he said. This is his stamping ground. He'd just come right back here. They're very territorial. We finally had to agree, and Garth was unzipped and tipped out of his bag. Black, yellow, and bronze coils of him glistening in the sunlight. Flat diamond-shaped head and yellow slitted eyes, forked tongue darting in and out. He unrolled himself and slithered along the porch and up into his bunk and made a big production, curling himself up in the middle of it. He was home, and he didn't look all that harmless to us. Well, I thought, we can always knock him off if he gets to be too much of a nuisance. Garth settled in with us as though he'd been ours all the time. He had his routine and didn't like it being disrupted, but the worst thing about him was his appearance. He looked a bit of getting used to. It's a bit disconcerting having a dirty big snake come sliding into the hut and put its head on your leg and ask for the rest of your mutton sandwich with its tongue. He'd have you on too. He'd come in from hunting all night and beg food off you as though he was starving, and his belly would be bulging like a stocking with a loaf of bread in it. He was sneaky as well. Food vanished in the most mysterious ways. He had an uncanny knack of knowing when you weren't watching the chops or sausages you were preparing to cook. You turned back to them and they'd be gone, and Garth's tail would be disappearing out the door. He had some rather unsnake-like taste, Garth. He'd eat the dishcloth, he ate a sneaker, he loved a pound of butter. He flogged my packet of tobacco off the arm of the chair I was sitting in, and I only just got it back off him before he swallowed it. He'd grab something and take off with it, and if you could get him by the tail and hang on, he'd drop it, once he knew he was caught. He was usually philosophical about miss-outs, and within a few minutes he'd be back inside, flicking his tongue around and eyeing up anything you had in your hand. He even snatched a savory off my fork, and I was raising it to my mouth. We had a Garth-proof cupboard, but heaven help us if we ever left it open. Everything had to be kept shut up in the cupboard, or in tins. We never saw any rats or mice around the place, but Garth was worse than a plague of them when it came to keeping your food safe. Even the old trick of hanging food from the rafters was no good with him around. He could climb like a supercharged Radavine. We found one way of partly controlling Garth. He was scared of fire. We didn't need a very big cooking fire in that climate, but Garth wouldn't go anywhere near it. If we wanted to protect something from him, we only had to put it beside the fire. But we couldn't do that with things like butter, and Garth particularly liked butter. Whenever we bought a pound of butter out, he'd fixed his eyes on it until he either got a chance to grab it or it was put away again. He got away with a lot of our butter until we got the idea of lighting a candle, even in the daytime, leaving it beside the butter. Garth was so scared of fire that he'd recoil and shrink away if you held even a candle too close to him. And if you wanted to call him, you only had to go outside and start scraping a plate, and if Garth was anywhere around, he'd come slithering along to see what you had for him this time. That was about the only degree of control we had over him. Now you mightn't know this, we didn't, but rock pythons will get as cheeky as you let them, and my wife started spoiling Garth rotten. She talked to him as though he was a child. She called him Diddums. She bought meat off the butcher for him when we went to town for supplies. She put a special blanket on his bed. Instead of giving him a kick, she'd step over him or around him. And a 10-foot snake and a 20-foot by 15-foot hut takes up a lot of space. My wife didn't take any notice of me when I warned her we were overdoing it. Garth was becoming overfamiliar. He wasn't begging anymore, he was demanding, and if he didn't get what he wanted, he'd get all moody and slither away and climb up to a mango tree and drape himself over a branch and sulk. He followed us half a mile to work one day and ate our lunch that was hanging in a bag in a tree. We knew it was Garth because he'd thrown a wobbly when we wouldn't let him have the omelet we cooked for our breakfast that morning, and even the newspaper our lunch had been wrapped in was gone. Garth didn't mind a bit of newspaper as long as it was wrapped around something he liked. He soon forgave us, though, and by the time we got back to the hut that night, things were back to normal. Mr. Bogglebelly was innocently curled up on his bunk and pretending to wake up just as we were dishing up our meal. He tried to swipe a sausage off my plate one night, and I gave him a whack with the broom, and he backed away with a hurt look and sulked across to his mother, who called him a poor Diddums and gave him a sausage off her plate. He had her conned. When Garth wanted something, he'd give you a smooge by wrapping a coil of himself around your leg and giving you an affectionate squeeze, and there was a surprising amount of strength in one of Garth's smooges. He playfully wrapped himself around my wife's waist when we were swimming in the river with him one day, and just about drowned her before I could get him unwrapped. Another drawback we found to having a python for a pet was the reactions of visitors to him. People are funny about snakes. One day a young bloke who dropped a roll of wire off at the hut for us came tearing down to where we were working to breathlessly warn us that there was a huge poisonous snake on our porch. When an English hitchhiker we'd offered a bunk for the night suddenly started screaming, we knew it was only because she just spotted Garth sliding along the rafter of the hut in the candlelight. The tin buyer ran back to his truck to get his gun. A cousin of my wife who came on a visit just about had a nervous breakdown and left after 3 days. She said Garth gave her the creeps. It was incidents like this that led us to the discovery of the most efficient deterrent to visitors we ever found. We nailed a sheet of corrugated iron on a gum tree where the track to the hut came off the road and painted a big sign on it saying, "The snake is tame." That cut the number of our visitors from very few to none at all. Quite a few times we heard vehicles pull up out on the road, pause long enough to read the sign and think about it for a few moments, and then drive away again. Garth was dominating our scene more than I felt was right. We found ourselves always defending him. We'd run into someone we knew in town, and they'd say, "Have you still got that snake out there?" "Yeah, why?" we'd say. "What are you doing with it?" they'd say. "A good question. I don't have any answers to it." And my wife didn't want any. She still reckoned that Garth was being misunderstood. Meanwhile, the object of all this continued chucking his growing weight around us, though he owned the place. My wife said it was just because he was a typical male, which turned out to be a bit of a joke between us later on. With the passage of time and tribulation, even my wife had to admit that Garth, cute and interesting and all as he was more trouble than he was worth. We could never relax whether he was around or not, and we were stuck with him. We began to wonder what on earth we were going to do with him, but Garth's fate was settled in the way most fates are, by coincidence. Some people in a boat coming down the river saw the smoke from our fire and came ashore for a look. They were a middle-aged German couple and 2 Abo blokes. We invited them up to the hut for a pannikin of tea. When the German bloke took some photographs of us tin scratchers, we've been doing it 4 months. I thought to tell them we had a tame snake lurking around somewhere, but someone was talking at the time and I missed the chance. Garth had a habit of disappearing when visitors arrived and turned up again when the food came out. We liked to warn people about him. The arrival of a 10-foot python could play merry hell with a tea party. We were sitting in the hut, porch drinking tea and eating damper and wild turkey when the German woman suddenly said, "Oh, what a lovely diamondback. Where did you get him?" Garth had come pouring himself around the corner of the hut, flickering his tongue and waving his head towards anyone who looked as though they might like to share their food with him. "Did you say her?" my wife said. "Yes," said the woman. "You can tell by the markings. The pattern of the male is larger and bolder. This is a marvelous female specimen." She started stroking Garth behind the head and letting him get too close to her leg of plain turkey. He liked a bit of turkey. My wife and I looked at each other. Garth was a lady snake. The German woman was a herpetologist. We didn't know what it meant either. It's someone who mucks around with snakes. She showed us a permit she had from the Queensland government to catch certain types of snakes to supply the zoos. They had 2 taipans, a king brown, and 2 blackwater snakes in boxes in their boat. Garth held no terrors for them. They made a great fuss of him and he lapped it up. He lay coiled untidily at the herpetologist's feet with a coil around her leg and his head on her lap, deigning to accept the stroking and all the turkey that was left in the camp oven. My wife and I never did adjust the idea of Garth being a female. The herpetologist told us a whole lot of stuff about the diamondback rock python, but we could have added a fair bit to what she knew. We lived with one of them. Well, you guessed it, the herpetologist wanted Garth. How much money did we want for her? She would be put in a perfect rock python environment and looked after for the rest of her life, much safer than out here in the wild. My wife and I went for a walk and had a yarn about it. The wet season was coming on and we were going to have to move back onto our boat, and there was no way we could take Garth with us. We knew too many people who'd been inclined to deal to Garth if they found him hanging around. He was too unafraid of humans, so we let Garth go with the herpetologist. We put him in a hessian sack, and the 2 Abo blokes carried him down to the boat on a pole, and that was the last we saw of him. We missed Garth around the place for a while, but agreed that he was probably pretty contented in the zoo. He always preferred to have food dishes up to him than go out and hunt for it. Yep, they make an interesting pet all right, the old rock python, but I wouldn't recommend rushing out and getting yourself one. They can get too interesting.